Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our discussion of informal fallacies. Now we are turning our attention to the fallacy called appeal to ignorance. This fallacy occurs when someone asserts that we have some reasons to accept some particular claim or some belief simply because you cannot disprove it. You cannot show that it's false. So, what's going on here? What's the basic idea? Well, the idea is that if someone cannot give evidence against their view, whatever that view happens to be, whatever that belief might be, well, then we have reason to believe it's true. But that's a problem, right? The mere fact that you can't disprove something doesn't mean that it's true. So it's just simply not the case that we should believe whatever we cannot disprove. That's not how the burden of proof actually works. Indeed, it's the person asserting some claim, whatever that claim is, that proposition P. That's the person who has the burden of proof. That's the person who has to actually offer evidence in support of the belief. That's not your job. It's not your job to prove that it's false or to disprove what they're claiming. Instead, that's their job. They are the ones that have to offer some reason to accept the belief that P. Again, I think it's going to be helpful to consider an example to spell out what's going on here. Here, I want to use a very famous example that comes from Bertrand Russell. It's called Russell's teapot. So, this is a thought experiment meant to illustrate why this fallacy is a problem. What's going on with the ignorance fallacy? So, the basic idea is that you're trying to shift the burden of proof, which is not legitimate. So, imagine that I claim that there's some tiny little teapot that's orbiting between the sun and the earth and Mars. Of course, since it's so small, then you can't detect it with any known telescope. No one could ever actually disprove this claim. No one could disprove that there's a teapot, a tiny little teapot orbiting between the Earth and Mars. Or another way to put that is no one could prove that it doesn't exist. Does this mean that you should believe that there is, in fact, a tiny little teapot that's orbiting between the Earth and Mars? No, you should not necessarily believe that without evidence, right? Do you actually think there is a teapot out there? Probably not. Why don't you? Because you have no good reason to believe it. So it's not your job to disprove this claim. It would be the person's job who's asserting this claim. It's their job to demonstrate that it's true. It's their job to demonstrate what evidence there is in support of this sort of claim. So I think most of us probably would not accept this claim without good evidence. And the mere fact that you cannot disprove it doesn't really tell us anything one way or the other. So even if you can't disprove it, right, this lack of disproof is not evidence in support of the belief. It's not evidence for anything. It's not evidence that the teapot actually does exist. Again, the burden of proof is on the person who's asserting that the teapot exists. It's up to them. It's their job to demonstrate that that claim is true. This is exactly the way it works in the court of law as well. If you have somebody that's on trial, maybe they're being suspected of murder, right? Well, it's the prosecutor's job to demonstrate that they did commit the murder. It is not the defense's job to demonstrate that they are innocent. The burden of proof is on the prosecutor, not the defense. The burden of proof is on the person making or asserting the claim that this person committed the murder. That's the way we should understand the burden of proof here. So the appeal to ignorance here is problematic, right? The fact that you can't disprove something doesn't tell us anything. And notice that this sort of fallacy comes up a lot within religious debates. Oftentimes people will say, well, you cannot disprove that God exists, therefore God must exist. But that's, again, just not the way the burden of proof works. If you believe that God exists, that's fine. If you're asserting that this belief is true, then it's your job to demonstrate the evidence in support of this belief. It is not anyone else's job to show that that belief is false. All right, so now I'm going to turn our attention to the appeal to emotion. Now, this fallacy actually does two different things. First, it uses one's emotions as a premise in an argument. And we saw previously why that's problematic. Remember that emotions are not truth apt. They're just physiological things that happen to us. They're not a statement that either could be true or false. So they cannot actually be used as a premise. Secondly, This appeal to emotion is very persuasive because it tries to arouse different feelings and different ways of getting you all ramped up. And so this appeal to emotion then is problematic when that's being used exclusively instead of using any reasons or evidence in support of a claim. But notice that emotions themselves are not the problem. We all have emotions. Again, they're just physiological things that happen to us almost against our will. Sometimes we get emotional without even understanding why we're getting emotional. And that's because it's a physiological process that's happening biologically in our bodies. The problem is when we appeal to emotion exclusively in support of something. It's when these emotions alone are being used in support of some conclusion, when they are being offered up as the reason for why you should believe something. That's when it's a problem. So then you can see why this particular kind of fallacy, where you're appealing to various emotions, offers up irrelevant premises because what's being used to support the conclusion of the argument cannot actually provide the needed truth for the conclusion. So these premises are irrelevant in that sense. So let's go ahead and take a look at a few examples to help us think about this particular fallacy. Imagine that somebody says, I know I didn't study for the exam and failed, but if you don't give me a passing grade, I'm going to lose my scholarship and disappoint my family. So could you just go ahead and pass me for their sake? So here, clearly, this is appealing to someone's emotion, which is not a good reason for any particular conclusion. Or imagine somebody says, most Americans actually support this new law, so it must be the right policy for this particular country. What's interesting here is you can see how this is both a kind of appeal to a person's emotions as well as a bandwagon fallacy, appealing to maybe popularity or groupthink, something along those lines. So it's helpful to recognize that we can have an overlap of different kinds of fallacies. Or imagine someone says, if we allow for this candidate to win the election, the economies will collapse and crime will skyrocket. So you have to vote for our party to stay safe. In this particular case, you're appealing to fear, right? You're offering up fear that the economy is going to collapse or that there's going to be a lot of crime, and so you should vote for a particular party in order to, avoid all those things that you're afraid of. So you're relying upon fear alone rather than any other actual information. Or consider something that you probably have heard of in the past couple of years. Somebody might say, well, if we don't secure the southern border immediately, then violent criminals and dangerous drugs will flood into our country and our communities and put every one of you, every American family at risk. Again, this is clearly just appealing to someone's fear. And in this particular case, it's offering up things that aren't even true. Or consider somebody that might say, well, if Donald Trump wins the election, then our democracy will be destroyed and America will turn into a dictatorship. Notice that there might be reasons to actually believe this. But if you are offering this up as an appeal to emotion, right, where you're exclusively relying on someone's feelings, their fear, well, then that's not a good reason to accept this claim. You would need to offer some other kind of reason, some evidence for support of this claim, rather than just simply appealing to somebody's fear for why you should not vote for Trump. Or imagine somebody says, you really should support this new environmental initiative because just imagine how proud and happy you'll feel when you're saving the planet for future generations. This particular example is interesting because instead of fear that's being appealed to, instead it's actually a kind of a hope. It's a way of thinking about doing good for our society, doing good for our future generations, which is a kind of an emotional response. But again, you need to be able to provide evidence. You need to give reasons for why you think this would be true. The mere fact that it would make you feel good is not reason to accept it, even if it's true that it would make you feel good or make you feel happy about yourself, that you're doing something good for the country or for future generations and for society itself. So these are all different versions of how someone might appeal to people's emotions. This happens all the time. And remember, we've talked about this in the past. Emotions are not truth apt. They're physiological responses. So they're not the sort of thing that can be either true or false. Nonetheless, that doesn't necessarily mean that emotions are bad. what we should do is we should recognize when we have emotions as being a kind of a red flag, that we should do more to seek out evidence, more to look to see if what we believe, what our claim is, if we have good reasons for those. Now, in the next video, we're going to turn our attention to a few other fallacies, what's called the red herring, the straw man fallacy, and two wrongs make a right. So that's what we're going to look at in the next video.